the 1800s, rich people would hold mummy unwrapping parties where people would come to watch the unwrapping process and then take bits home with them as a souvenir from the evening. I've run out of my foundation, that's why I'm filling it out with concealer. During the bubonic plague, people thought that bad smells were what was causing the spread of disease. So to combat the miasma, people would carry around little scented balls of herbs and spices called pomanders. But of course, they didn't really help because the rats and the fleas were thriving in the unsanitary conditions instead. And in 1886, Sawdust Jack ended up racing James Gordon across the country with a wheelbarrow, and a wheelbarrow race phenomenon supposedly spread across the country. So it started in Newcastle when, what was his name? John Martin, or Sawdust Jack, was trying to push through the crowds to get through to start his race, and he said that he would race all the way to London and he would do 30 kilometres a day with his really heavy wheelbarrow. But actually James overtook him, and 4 days later Sawdust Jack gave up because James was miles ahead despite starting in Dundee instead, but he beat him to London and became a little bit of a hero in the local papers. In 1858, the smell coming from the Thames in London stank so much that Parliament suspended its meetings, but actually it was sort of a good thing because eventually it meant they had to build a proper sewage system, and it led to major public health reforms. Apparently King Louis XIV of France did really smelly farts, but he also liked really strong perfumes, so he would wear them to try and cover up as well, so you could absolutely smell him coming from quite a way away. And the Victorians thought that bathing too often made you ill, so they used lots of perfumes and powders to cover up, so you probably could have smelt them coming too. But back to the stinky Thames of London. So the Thames was so full of human waste, dead animals, industrial waste, lots of gross things basically. So then when they had a particularly hot summer in 1858, the Thames dropped, leaving sewage on the riverbanks, and then the heat of the sun essentially baked it on and made the stink even worse. So much so that people started vomiting if they got too close to it. And people thought that it was causing a disease in itself because there had actually been 3 outbreaks of cholera just before it all started happening, so they thought the Thames was causing cholera as well. Bloodletting with leeches to help cure illnesses, or animal dung or poop as soothing creams and balms were used before germ theory was understood. Through time, toothpaste has been made of various different things. The ancient Egyptians would make theirs using burnt eggshells, the ancient Romans using oyster shells or bones, and then in the 1800s toothpaste was made using chalk or soap. And the corpse flower was famous for its smell of rotting flesh, and it became well known, if not a gross attraction, in Victorian botanical gardens. It's called Titanarum, and it can grow up to 12 feet, and the flower has sort of essentially this giant spike in the middle of it. And yes, it smells like rotting meat and flesh, or your food bin. Basically, it's pretty disgusting, but it only blooms for 24 hours every 2 to 3 years, supposedly. So probably now still today, if not just in the Victorian times, it's quite a marvel that people like to come and visit in botanical gardens. Supposedly Henry VIII had Catherine Howard's body covered with limes when she was buried so that it would disintegrate quicker. In 1819, men had supposedly grown tired of riding horses, so they started riding the dandy horse, which is essentially like a little hobby horse or a bike without pedals, and it's said that the Prince Regent, later George IV, he's George IV at that point, anyway, he had 4 of the little hobby horse things, but some say it's not because he was young and hip and cool, but it's actually because at that point he was so overweight. And according to a late Anglo-Saxon chronicle, vampires were rife at the time in England. In one village it said that there were 2 peasants who died, but they were still seen walking around the village carrying their coffins on their back, and they would knock on people's doors, and whoever's name they called out, that person then got ill or sometimes even died. So the villagers decided to open up their graves, and they found their bodies were strangely not decayed, and they had handkerchiefs over their faces that had blood on them. So naturally, oh my gosh, I need to be more careful with this, seriously. Naturally, they cut off their heads and put them between their legs, and then they took out their hearts and burned them, because that's how you get rid of a vampire. And it's said that then 2 birds flew up from the burning hearts, and they weren't seen again, and the people who were ill suddenly got better. Maybe not suddenly, probably slowly got better, isn't it? But you get the gist. The story was also recorded in the 1190s by William of Newburgh, but when writing, apparently he actually also says that writing about these vampires is kind of boring because it was so commonplace. And it's true, apparently in the medieval period there were lots of vampires and even stories of zombies too. The first female doctor from history is Merit Ptah, and she's recorded from 2700 BCE in hieroglyphs in a tomb found from, well, ancient Egypt. It said that she was the chief physician. In the 1800s, rather strangely, the aristocracy took up making their shoes. I suppose they were bored and they had the money. Women embroidered anyway, so they could now just do it on some shoes instead, I guess. And in 1929, in the Sussex County magazine, we have the publication of a story called The Dragon of Knuckler Hole. But it's been part of the folktale for a while before then, of course, as folktale tends to work. And dragons are a big part of British cultural stories anyway, aren't they? So, but yeah, this is when it's written down. So it's said that there's a dragon living in a pool near Lyminster or Lyminster, don't know how you pronounce it, but Jim Pottock decides he's going to deal with the dragon, and he takes him a huge suet pudding, and the dragon eats it all, gobbles it all up, along with Jim's poor horse and cart. What did I just say? Horse and cart. That didn't work. He eats the pudding, eats the horse and cart, and then demands Jim brings him more. So he does, he brings an even bigger one. And the story then says, that looks gross, that the pudding gives the dragon the collywobbles, which I love. But so the pudding makes him ill, and Jim then pretends to be going to give him some medicine, and actually just hits him on the head with an axe and kills him. And that's the story of the dragon of Knuckle Hole. Knucker Hole. I don't know what I've been saying. I feel like I said knuckle. It's knucker. During World War II, red lipstick became symbolic of a lot of things. Firstly, Hitler hated it and actually tried to ban cosmetics altogether. So it became a symbol of victory against the Nazis, and then eventually a symbol against fascism. It was a symbol of patriotism as well, encouraged by Winston Churchill, but also the US, because the US military made it mandatory for women who joined the army after 1941 to wear red lipstick. And the Allied governments actually launched propaganda campaigns about wearing the lipstick, and it rallied everyone together. It was a bit of a, way, stuff the Nazis, let's wear our red lipstick. And they had slogans like, beauty is your duty. And apparently Winston Churchill wanted women to keep looking their best during these trying times. And in Britain, lipstick wasn't actually rationed because, according to the Food Ministry, cosmetics are as important to women as tobacco is to men. Before that, of course, the red lipstick was commonly more a sign of debauchery, and only actresses should be found with it in their handbag. And then as the women's empowerment and suffrage movement grew, it became more of a sign of disobedience. In the 1920s, a suffragette march actually went past Elizabeth Arden's studio, and she stood outside handing them tubes of red lipstick, which actually caused a really powerful, empowering march for these women and inspired women across the country as well to start wearing the lipstick. Of course, there's so much more history to it, like with Prohibition, the Great Depression, and with Hollywood then coming through. But when the US military made it mandatory for those women to wear red lipstick, Elizabeth Arden was rewarded for her previous girl power moment, and she was the one who designed the specific shade of lipstick, blush, and nail varnish that the military women would wear. And she also designed one for the civilians as well, which was Victory Red. And I never wear red lipstick, I don't think it suits me, but if it's for girl power, I'll be wearing it. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, or Marcus Aurelius, was the last in the line of emperors that was known as Rome's 5 good emperors who made up the Nerva Antonine dynasty. But I feel like he's more famous on here for being a Stoic philosopher over an emperor, when he said things like, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts," or, "When you arise in the morning, think of what a precious privilege it is to be alive, to breathe, to think, to enjoy, to love." He was a beloved and wise emperor, but rather than in the first Gladiator film, he wasn't killed by his evil son. He's actually said to have died from the Antonine Plague that swept Europe at the time. But it is still sort of thought to be a little bit suspicious, but not really, because basically Marcus Aurelius was sort of at the end of a war with some Germanic tribes on the edge of the Roman Empire, and his son Commodus was there at the time when he died, and he then very quickly just ended the war with a quick peace treaty. He didn't keep fighting, and then he zoomed off back to Rome as emperor, but appointing slaves to be in charge because he just wanted to be a gladiator. So it's all a little bit weird, but he did just die from the plague, I think. When Marcus Aurelius dies, his son Commodus becomes emperor. He very quickly appoints 2 friends / slaves to rule the empire instead, and he zooms off to go to gladiator school to become a gladiator, which seems mad to most people because in the gladiator games it's a battle of life and death, so it's slaves that would fight. So why the emperor is stooping so low, no one knows. And he essentially just bankrupts Rome with the constant games. Naturally, he gave himself a huge salary for taking part in the games. It said he enjoyed to fight animals, although when he did, he came out dressed as the god Mercury and would just shoot them with a bow and arrow instead, so didn't really fight them. He also liked to come out dressed as Hercules in god form, so he would wear the lion skin and carry a club. And then when picking opponents for his normal gladiator battles, he tended to pick people that he thought he could defeat. Well, he could defeat easily. He would pick women, people with physical and mental disabilities, and he would give them blunt weapons as well. And then when he did kill them, he really wanted to make them suffer to show off his sword skills. I don't really know, but he wouldn't just kill them quickly and be nice. Not that you can be nice, but you know what I mean. He would make them suffer. During his reign, he changed the name of Rome to Colonia Commodianus, meaning the colony of Commodus. The Senate to the Commodian Fortunate Senate, and the people, the plebs, to Commodianus. And he renames all the months of the year after his various different titles, so he's being slightly demanding. He even declares himself the new Romulus, so a new founder of Rome essentially. But after 12 years of being emperor, he leaves a list of people he wants to kill on his desk, and his mistress finds it. His mistress, his trainer, and some people as part of the Senate were on this list, sorry. So they decide to kill him first instead. As the New Year's Eve celebrations of the year 192 were about to start happening, he was instead strangled in his bath by a man called Narcissus. Lucilla, the character in the new Gladiator film that I believe is the mother of Paul Mescal's character, let me know in the comments if it is, I don't actually know, but in real history her name is Annia Aurelia Galeria Lucilla, and she was born in the year 150. She's the second daughter of Marcus Aurelius, and so the sister of the Emperor Commodus. Firstly, she marries Lucius Verus, who was Marcus Aurelius's adopted brother and co-ruler for a bit, so when they are ruling together in around the year 164, she is Augusta, or Empress of Rome, and she's living quite a nice life, and apparently she's enjoying it. And it does last when her brother Commodus then takes over until he gets married, and then she loses the lifestyle she's accustomed to. Actually, just before that point though, in the year 169, Verus dies and her dad makes her remarry another person, but this time he's of much less high status, and she's really not impressed by that. His last name's like Pompeianus, I think. She starts to notice that Commodus is slightly mad and very dangerous for Rome, so she starts to gather some people in a plot to kill him, including her husband and her nephew. But her nephew, who is the one who's going to try and kill Commodus, but he moves far too Her nephew moves far too slowly and is caught, and the plot is exposed, and in the year 181 or 182 she is exiled to the Isle of Capri because she's been planning to kill the emperor, and then actually Commodus goes, no, let's kill her. So she's executed. So she wouldn't have been alive to be in Gladiator 2, but I don't even know if she is. And if she is, who cares? It's not a documentary, it's a film, it's a story, it's made up. The cook of Henry VIII once received the death penalty of being boiled alive after he accidentally poisoned the soup, but is it possible that the food tester for the king was actually just allergic to something? In the Roman times, you might dye your hair with a mixture of leeches and vinegar that was pickled for 40 days, and so would possibly just be poisoning you. Poor Romans would sometimes use shards of pottery as toilet roll, but there was evidence that they would have smoothed it down before using it. And in the 17th century, to make violin strings thicker, sheep innards were intertwined with the string, which was a pretty gross job. String makers would really carefully have to kill their sheep to make sure that the innards didn't rupture. And I'm not entirely sure my new makeup headband is that practical. Apparently when Richard the Lionheart captured Cyprus, he made all the men shave their beards off. Poems from the 1700s reference the fact that women would trap mice and then skin them in order to glue their fur onto their face in lieu of shaving off eyebrows. In lieu, was that the right word? I think it was. In 1780, the chainsaw was invented in order to cut through the pelvic bone quicker to try and save the dying mothers from very long and dangerous surgery that previously was done with a tiny little knife. And in ancient Rome, some people's jobs were being vomit collectors, where one would assume they collected all the vomit that would occur after a big Roman feast. It's said that Stone Age people would have killed a bear, ripped open its stomach, and then eaten the meat that the bear had just eaten. In the 18th century, it was common to cut the gums of your baby in order to let the teeth break through, rather than letting them teeth naturally, because it was thought that teething was more dangerous, and it led to seizures and various other random illnesses. Making matches in factories was done by girls or women who would dip the little wooden sticks into a phosphorus solution, which was fine for the first few years, but eventually you would develop phossy jaw, which was when the phosphorus that you had been breathing in for so many years started to make your gums abscess and gave you a horrible smelly discharge, and eventually gave your jaw an eerie glow, and the only way out was removing the jawbone, which... Ugh. One time in the Colosseum in ancient Rome, 10,000 people were killed just for fun. If you had a toothache in ancient Egypt, you would kill a mouse and put it in your mouth. In Victorian cities, bone grubbers would take gross rotten old bones from butchers, from rubbish bins, from stockyards, and they would sell them on to dealers, who in turn would sell them on to be made into various things like toothbrushes, babies' teething rings, or even soap making. This is reasons why I love Lady Jane Grey, although we should refer to her as Queen Jane Grey, because she was Queen of England for 9 days, or 13 days depending on who you ask. Firstly, I love her because she had the same tutor as Elizabeth I growing up, and he said that Jane was the smarter of the two. Even though she was so devastated that she fell to the ground when being told her cousin Edward, the king, had died and that she was now to be queen, she got up, she carried on, and she made the best of it, and she did the best she could. She didn't just give in to the men around her who were trying to get her to give the power of her crown to her husband. She refused to proclaim him king, which, quite rightly so, is her throne. She was incredibly brave and strong, and at just 17 years old gave us possibly the most devastating execution of the Tudor era, after she panicked when stepping up to the block and asked the executioner, "What do I do?" And she's got a new show coming out on Prime Video that apparently is going to rewrite history when it comes out on the 27th. Spots have always been an issue, even in antiquity, so I don't really know why we worry about them so much, or maybe why I worry about them or care about them. But ancient Greek physicians like Aristotle or Hippocrates said that acne was associated with puberty, so we've known for a really long time, maybe not necessarily that it was something to do with hormones, but that it was something to do with when you turn a certain age. The word for acne that the ancient Greeks used actually meant the start of beard growth. So again, a certain age, you start to get acne, you start to get a beard. But the Egyptian word meant boils or sores, and they thought that spots were something you got because you were telling lies. The ancient Greeks thought that the skin disease sounds really harsh, but that's what it is basically. They thought that it was a manifestation of internal problems, and if you've heard anything about Greek medicine or Hippocrates before, you know that I'm about to tell you that they thought it was something to do with the four humours. And I don't think it's a completely outrageous idea, thinking that the pores on your face could be like a way for the humours or something to get out. Like, it makes sense. The ancient Greeks and Egyptians used honey and sulphur as a cure for their spots, but the Roman Theodosius said that you should wipe your face with a towel while you were watching the stars fall from the sky, because that would make the spots fall from your face. And interestingly, they found anti-acne remedies in the tomb of Tutankhamun. So really, if an ancient Egyptian pharaoh had spots, I think I'm fine having a few. Of course, there's other developments and ideas for reasons and cures, like the Tudors thinking, of course, it was a mark of a witch, but I think the most interesting is from 1648. So the source I found just says Riolanus and Johnson, so what Johnson or who Johnson, I don't know, but it says vari, which was spots, are little hard tumours on the skin of the face curdled up of a hard thick juice. They are known easily. They are of the bigness of hemp seed, and they infect young people that are inclined to venery and fruitful, but chaste withal and continent. So, if you're a little bit adventurous when you're too young, in a naughty way, then you're going to get spots. But I think I'll just say mine's the mark of a witch rather than the other reason they just gave. Oliver Cromwell was executed after he was already dead. So in 1660, after he died, Charles II was brought back in as king. But obviously, Cromwell had executed his father, destroyed the monarchy, changed the country, so Charlie Boy wanted revenge. But Cromwell's already dead from malaria and kidney stones, so he is exhumed and posthumously executed. His head was then stuck on a spike outside Westminster for 30 years, before then going around various collectors. The Bayeux tapestry isn't a tapestry, it's an embroidery, and it's actually probably mostly inaccurate, like the most famous scene with King Harold getting shot with the arrow through his eye. Nah, written reports at the time say that actually he was hacked to death by a group of Norman knights instead. And despite being King of England for 10 years, Richard the Lionheart actually only spent 6 months in the country. Henry I died after eating too much fish, so he loved to eat lampreys, which were this weird, like, prehistoric kind of fish, and after one particularly big feasting night, the toxins from the fish made him really ill and killed him. I don't know how I missed my eyebrow so badly just then. Charles Dickens was scared of trains after one particularly bad journey. He was travelling on a train when it fell off a bridge. Now he was okay and he actually managed to help others escape the wreckage, but he then avoided trains forevermore, quite rightly so. But also, fun fact, is that he missed the inquest that was investigating the crash because at the time he had been travelling with his mistress, so he didn't want anyone to know. And on the 15th of May 1800, George III survived 2 assassination attempts. The first medical procedure that we have evidence of is trepanation, where they drill or scrape a hole into your head. But apparently in Borneo, over 30,000 years ago, there's evidence of a leg amputation being performed on a Stone Age child. Whereas there's skulls from France that show trepanation happening in 6,500 BCE. Between the 17th and 19th century, there was a little ice age when the River Thames in London froze over the most often, and the stewards used to have frost fairs on them. There's other years when the Thames freezing over was recorded, but apparently it happened most often between the 17th and 19th centuries, and the last time it froze over was in 1963. And the first or the oldest discovered board game was the royal game of The first pub in England came in the year 43. The Stuart era had 7 monarchs, and the Victorians liked wearing black because of the pollution. But let's explain. So of course black was popular in the Victorian era because their queen only wore black after the death of her husband. But it was also the industrial era, so the sky was really black and mucky from soot from it being the industrial era, but also from fireplaces, so if you wore black it hid all the muck and the soot a bit easier. Basically, black masks pollution. The 7 monarchs of the Tudor era begin in 1566 with James I. You then have Charles I, that dodgy middle bit with Oliver Cromwell, then Charles II, James II, William and Mary II, and then Anne in 1714. And yes, one of the many things we can thank the Romans for are pubs. They were actually wine shops though that were on the side of the roads, and they were called tabernae. The first modern flushable toilet was invented in 1596, or rather it's described in that year by Sir John Harrington, who invented it for his godmother, Queen Elizabeth I. And it was a 2-foot deep bowl, waterproofed with wax or resin, with water that was flushable from above coming from a cistern. The slaves and labourers that built the pyramids were often paid using beer, refreshing and nutritional. Supposedly. And Vikings didn't wear horned helmets. That was made up by a 19th century artist. There's no archaeological evidence for them, and helmets were there to protect you in battle, so horns wouldn't have really been helpful anyway. It was Carl Emil Doppler who gave his Viking characters horned helmets in their costumes for a production of a Wagner opera being performed in the 1870s. Edward Teach, or Blackbeard, would weave hemp into his beard so that before they would go and capture a ship, he could intimidate them by being on fire. Apparently it was fashionable in the Tudor era for upper-class women to expose themselves, and it was customary for unmarried women. So Queen Elizabeth used it to make a point of her being the Virgin Queen, and she sometimes even had her belly out as well. And supposedly she greeted the French ambassador with her boobs fully out one time, but I don't know where that evidence has come from. And the ancient Egyptians would shave their heads to avoid lice, but then wear wigs made of human hair to protect their heads from the sun. But let's go back to Blackbeard for a second. It's said that he had 14 wives. He actually started out as a privateer serving on an English ship during the War of the Spanish Succession, but like many other privateers, when the war ended in 1713, he turned to piracy. Did you know that Bluetooth was named after a Viking king? The King Harold united different regions and had a very strong kingdom. So Bluetooth was named after him because the technology unites different devices. But why was he called Bluetooth in the first place? Vikings often had quite similar names, so nicknames became quite common. Some Vikings, like Joran Wisdom Slope or Ord the Deep-Minded, were named after their mind and their intelligence and their wisdom, whereas others were named, unfortunately, like Swain Forkbeard or Catil Flatnose, were named after their appearance. There's other good ones like Ivor the Boneless or Walking Hrolf, who was too big for horses to carry. So, that being said, Bluetooth probably referred to a dead tooth that had gone a dark colour. In the Old Norse language, blar is the spectrum of black to blue colours, so it makes sense. But the word also meant the colours of the metallic shining of armour and weapons, but also the colour of death itself.